The world before the first dawn of civilization was not a world of noise, but a world of profound, weightless suspension. It was a time when the earth breathed in a slow, rhythmic slumber, and the passage of millennia was marked only by the shifting of tectonic plates and the advance and retreat of the great crystalline glaciers. Imagine, if you will, the vastness of the Pleistocene, a landscape of such immense, lonely beauty that it would seem alien to our modern eyes. Here, the horizon was an unbroken line of silver and gold, stretching across a wilderness that knew nothing of the wheel, the wall, or the written word. In this deep time theater, the human spirit was a flickering candle, precarious and thin, held against the howling winds of an indifferent cosmos. We were wanderers, ghosts in the landscape, moving with the seasonal pulse of the herds and the ripening of wild grains. Our footprint was light, a mere indentation in the dust that the first rain would wash away, leaving the earth as pristine and silent as it had been for 1 billion years. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in a world without history. It is the silence of the Great Rift Valley at midnight, where the only sound is the crackle of a dying fire and the distant, haunting yip of a jackal. It is the silence of the Siberian tundra, where the permafrost holds the secrets of the mammoth and the musk ox in a frozen, lightless grip. In this cathedral of stillness, our ancestors lived lives of brutal elegance. Their reality was defined by the sensory, the immediate, and the visceral. They knew the texture of flint against the palm, the way a strike at the perfect angle would shed a flake as sharp as a predator's tooth. They knew the smell of the coming snow, a metallic sharpness in the air that signaled the need to move, to find shelter, to huddle together for a warmth that was the only thing standing between them and the void. To be human in this era was to be a creature of the elements, governed by the same ancient laws that commanded the migration of the salmon or the flowering of the acacia tree. We must look closely at the body of this wanderer, this silent witness to the dawn of time. Their feet were calloused and wide, mapped by the grit of 1,000 different soils. Their eyes, unburdened by the glare of artificial light, were attuned to the slightest movement in the tall grass, the subtle ripple that betrayed the presence of a leopard or the sway of a heavy antlered deer. Within their marrow lived the memory of every ancestor who had survived the long dark, a genetic record of endurance that was being refined by the cold and tempered by the sun. But even then, in the quiet of the cave, something was stirring. Deep within the folds of the neocortex, a quiet error in the code of life was beginning to hum. It was a subtle shift, a biological yearning to bridge the gap between the internal dream and the external reality. For tens of thousands of years, this impulse remained a whisper, a shadow on the wall of the mind, waiting for the world itself to change. The Tigris and the Euphrates, those twin arteries of the ancient world, flowed through a landscape of desolate paradise. In this era, they were wild, capricious gods. They did not flow through tidy channels or under the gaze of stone watchers. They meandered through vast, trackless marshes of reed and silt, spilling over their banks in chaotic floods that reshaped the geography of the delta every season. The air here was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the rotting sweetness of the swamp. It was a place of immense fertility, yet it remained a blank slate. The reeds swayed in the breeze, hundreds of miles of green stalks that whispered to the wind, oblivious to the fact that one day they would be sharpened into styluses to record the laws of kings. The silt, rich with the mineral wealth of the Armenian highlands, settled in deep, dark layers, waiting for the hand of man to realize that this mud could be baked into the very foundations of eternity. At this stage of our story, the future was merely a repetition of the past. A child born into a tribe of hunters 40,000 years ago could expect to live a life identical to that of their great-great-grandfather. The tools remained the same. The stories, told in the flickering amber light of the campfire, remained the same. The relationship with the divine was a conversation with the spirits of the rocks and the trees. There was no concept of progress, only the cycle. The circle was the dominant shape of existence, the circle of the seasons, the circle of the moon, the circle of the family huddled around the hearth. To step outside the circle was to court death. The wilderness was not a resource to be conquered, but a deity to be appeased. We were a part of the wild, and the wild was a part of us, an intimate and terrifying embrace that left no room for the ambition of empires. But consider the vulnerability of this existence. To be a ghost in the landscape meant to be at the mercy of the smallest fluctuation in the environment. A late frost, a dried-up spring, a shift in the migration patterns of the gazelle, any of these could spell the end of a lineage that had survived for eons. The cost of our freedom was an absolute fragility. We carried our entire world on our backs, a few skins, a handful of tools, a pouch of dried meat. We had no silos, no storehouses, no walls to keep out the night. Every morning was a new negotiation with survival. And yet, in this precariousness, there was a sacredness. Because every meal was a gift and every dawn was a miracle, the Paleolithic mind developed a profound connection to the living earth. We see it in the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, the way the flickering torchlight makes the painted bison seem to breathe, to run, to exist in a space between the physical and the spiritual. These were the first marks upon the clay of the soul, the first evidence that the silence was beginning to break. As we move through the deep time of the Pleistocene, the environment begins to lean against the human body with a new kind of pressure. The great ice was beginning its long, slow retreat, a process that lasted thousands of years, changing the chemistry of the atmosphere and the rhythm of the rains. In the Near East, the landscape began to dry, the forests receding to the mountains and leaving behind the vast open plains. This was the crucible of the Neolithic. The silence was still there, but it was becoming expectant. The nomadic tribes began to linger longer in certain places, the places where the wild grains grew thickest, where the water never failed. They began to notice the way a seed dropped in the moist earth would return as a plant. This was not a sudden discovery, but a slow, observational intimacy with the earth. It was a silent conversation between the human hand and the wild grass, a negotiation that would eventually lead to the greatest revolution in our history. Imagine an ancestor standing at the edge of the Mesopotamian marshes. The sun is setting, casting a long crimson shadow across the water. This individual does not know they are standing in the cradle of civilization. They only know that the fish are plentiful and the grain is ripe. They feel the weight of their child on their hip and the ache in their joints from a day of gathering. In their mind, they are simply surviving another day. But deep within their genetic code, the silent error is growing louder. The human brain, evolved for the complexities of social hunting, was now being repurposed for the complexities of settlement. We were beginning to dream of permanence. We were beginning to wonder if we could stay. This transition was not a joyful ascent, but a period of profound biological stress. To settle was to invite disease. To farm was to invite back-breaking labor that the human spine was not yet fully evolved to endure. The transition from the nomadic ghost to the sedentary builder was written in the bones, in the wear and tear of the vertebrae, in the thinning of the enamel on the teeth as the diet shifted from a diverse array of wild foods to the monotonous grind of grain. This was the cost of the dream. We were trading the freedom of the wilderness for the security of the granary, a bargain that would forever alter the trajectory of our species. The survival advantage of agriculture was a double-edged sword, providing more calories, but at the price of our physical health and our egalitarian spirit. And yet, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates continued their ancient, indifferent flow. They did not care about the human struggle. They were massive, unthinking forces of nature, carrying the mountain snows down to the Persian Gulf. But the silt they deposited was becoming a magnet. As the surrounding lands grew more arid, the life-giving waters of the delta became the only hope for a growing population. The desolate paradise was becoming crowded. The silence of the primeval forest was being replaced by the murmur of 1,000 voices, the clatter of stone tools, and the first tentative experiments in building with the earth itself. We are approaching the threshold of a new era, a moment where the long and breathless suspension finally snaps. The story of Sumer is not just a story of archaeology. It is the biography of the human body finally asserting its will over the landscape. It is the moment when the silent memory carved in bone begins to be translated into the marks upon the clay. But before the first city could rise, before the first king could be crowned, there had to be this long poetic twilight. This period of waiting in the reeds, where the mind of man was like a dark room, waiting for someone to strike a light. The world was still a cathedral of silence, but the doors were about to be thrown open. The future would no longer be a repetition of the past. The cycle was about to become a line, a vector pointing toward the stars. And as the sun rose over the marshes of Mesopotamia, it didn't just illuminate the water, it illuminated the first stirrings of a collective consciousness that would eventually build the world we inhabit today. But for now, in this deep time memory, let us linger in the silence. Let us feel the dampness of the river mist and the roughness of the unworked stone. Let us honor the ghosts of our ancestors who walked through the darkness for 40,000 years, carrying the spark of our potential in their tired, calloused hands, waiting for the dawn that they would never see, but which they made possible by the simple, heroic act of surviving. As the eons pressed forward, the very nature of human thought began to crystallize. In the centuries leading up to the Great Awakening, the way our ancestors perceived time itself began to shift. To the wanderer, time is a circle, a wheel of seasons, a return of the herd, a recurring moon. But as the first permanent dwellings appeared, time began to stretch out into a line. A house is a statement of intent. It is a claim made against the future. To build a wall is to say, I will be here tomorrow, and my children will be here after I am gone. This was a radical departure from the ancient law of the wild. It was the first time the human mind dared to conceive of a legacy that was not merely biological, but material. Consider the first mud bricks. They were not the perfect, kiln-fired rectangles of a later age, but sun-dried lumps of earth, shaped by hands that were still more accustomed to the spear than the trowel. This mud was the literal flesh of the river, a mixture of water, silt, and straw that bound the landscape into a new form. This was the first biography of the body, written in the earth, a physical extension of the human need for shelter and order. As these bricks were stacked, the silence of the landscape was broken by a new sound, the rhythmic thud of construction. It was a slow, hypnotic sound, a heartbeat of progress that would eventually grow into the roar of a metropolis. In this transitional era, the survival weapon of the human species was shifting from individual prowess to collective coordination. In the hunt, success depended on the stealth and strength of the few. In the burgeoning settlements of the Near East, survival began to depend on the cooperation of the many. This required a new kind of social architecture, a way to manage the tensions of living in close proximity. We can almost hear the whispered negotiations around the fires of these early villages, the first tentative efforts to establish laws, to share the harvest, to protect the communal water source. It was a delicate, fragile experiment in being human together. The vulnerability of this new way of life was immense. A single fire could sweep through a village of reed and mud in minutes. A single season of drought could turn the communal granary into a tomb. And yet, the ancestors persisted. They were driven by a biological imperative they did not fully understand, a hunger for the security of the stone stacked upon stone. They were trading the wide-open horizons of the steppe for the narrow, dusty streets of the first proto-cities, and in doing so, they were fundamentally rewriting the human experience. And what of the rivers? The Tigris and the Euphrates remained the great, unblinking eyes of the landscape. They saw the first small dams, the first primitive canals, the first attempts to redirect the lifeblood of the future. They responded with their characteristic violence, their floods sweeping away the puny works of man, forcing the survivors to rebuild, to learn, to adapt. This was the ancient memory carved in bone, being tested against the raw power of the planet. Every time the river rose, it challenged the human spirit to prove its worth. And every time the people returned to the mud to rebuild their homes, they were forging a bond with the land that would eventually become the foundation of Sumer. The silent witness of the earth records this era as one of profound transition. In the layers of soil, we see the disappearance of the wild forest and the emergence of the domesticated field. We see the bones of the wolf being replaced by the bones of the dog, the first animal to enter into the human circle. We see the emergence of pottery, the first time the human hand used fire to transform the earth into a vessel for the water. Each pot was a miracle, a way to hold the river in the palm of one's hand. These vessels were the first libraries, holding not books, but the sustenance that allowed the mind to dream. As we stand on the precipice of the first dawn, we must realize that the Sumerian mystery, the sudden appearance of a fully formed civilization, was actually the result of this long, slow accumulation of small changes. The spark that had not yet been struck was the cumulative energy of 1,000 generations of wanderers who had finally decided to stop. The desolate paradise was ready. The code of life had been rewritten. The silent dream of the Paleolithic was about to become the loud, vibrant reality of the Bronze Age. And so, the world held its breath. The reeds of the Euphrates stilled their whispering. The moon rose over the ziggurat that did not yet exist, casting its light on a land that was about to change forever. The Cathedral of Silence was about to be filled with the songs of the first priests, the cries of the first merchants, and the scratching of the first scribes. The future was no longer a repetition. The first dawn was coming, and with it, the end of the long suspension. We were no longer ghosts in the landscape. We were about to become the masters of the earth. But even as we look forward to the glory of Ur and Uruk, let us not forget the beauty of the silence that came before. Let us remember the nomadic wanderings, the fleeting shadows of the campfire, and the profound connection to the wild that we lost when we built our first walls. For even now, in the heart of our modern cities, that ancient silence still lives, a vestige of our origins, a memory of a time when we were one with the wind and the stars, waiting in the darkness for the world to begin. The transition from the wild to the walled city was not merely a change in geography. It was a fundamental restructuring of the human soul. To understand the silence before the dawn, we must imagine the internal landscape of an ancestor who stood between these two worlds. Their mind was a bridge. In one hand, they held the ancestral memory of the hunt, the deep, wordless knowledge of how to track a wounded deer through the twilight. In the other, they held the new, heavy curiosity of the builder. They were the first to look at a heap of river clay and see not just mud, but the potential for a home that would outlast their own life. This was the birth of deep time thinking, the realization that our actions could echo down through the centuries. In the silence of the genome, the traits that had served us as wanderers were being repurposed. The high-resolution vision that once spotted a predator's ear in the tall grass was now being used to align the rows of a barley field or to observe the subtle movements of the planets. The manual dexterity that had crafted the perfect obsidian blade was now being applied to the delicate art of weaving and the forming of clay tablets. We were the same animals, but we were beginning to operate on a different frequency. The biological wonder of the human hand, with its opposable thumb and its myriad of nerve endings, was becoming the primary tool of a new kind of evolution, one that was cultural rather than purely genetic. As the marshes of Mesopotamia began to host the first permanent settlements, a new sensory world emerged. Gone was the absolute silence of the primeval forest, replaced by the symphony of a human community. There was the rhythmic grinding of grain, a sound that would become the backbeat of civilization for the next 10,000 years. There was the bleating of penned sheep, the first animals to be folded into the human social structure. There was the smell of wood smoke that no longer drifted away with the nomadic wind, but lingered over the village, a constant, comforting presence. These were the day-in-the-life details of a revolution in progress. Imagine a woman sitting in the doorway of her mud-brick hut at dusk. She is grinding barley, her movements steady and ancient. She looks out over the small patch of cultivated land that her family has claimed from the wilderness. She remembers the stories her grandmother told, stories of the long walks, the hungry winters, and the constant fear of the dark. Now, she feels a different kind of fear, the fear of the harvest failing, the fear of the river rising too high. But she also feels a new kind of pride. She is part of something that is growing, something that has a name. She is no longer a ghost. She is a citizen of the first dawn. This sense of survival versus vulnerability was the defining tension of the era. The security of the settlement was a fragile thing, constantly threatened by the unpredictability of the natural world. The Tigris and the Euphrates, those desolate paradises, were also silent witnesses to countless tragedies. Every year the floodwaters would arrive, a surging wall of brown water that could dissolve a mud-brick village in a single night. This constant threat forced the emergence of leadership. Someone had to organize the digging of the canals. Someone had to manage the communal response to the disaster. The ancient accidents of geography were forcing the creation of the first hierarchies. In this crucible, the human trait of cooperation was being stretched to its limits. In the small nomadic band, cooperation was natural and based on kinship. In the growing settlements, people had to learn to cooperate with strangers. They had to develop a social code that could replace the biological code of the tribe. This was the true origin of the state. It was a biological adaptation of the mind, a way to expand the circle of the hearth, to include hundreds and eventually thousands of individuals. This shift was as significant as the development of upright walking or the mastery of fire. It was the moment when we began to function as a superorganism. And as the ice continued to retreat far to the north, the climate of the Fertile Crescent reached a tipping point. The rains became more predictable, the soils more stable. The long and breathless suspension was coming to an end. The earth itself seemed to be inviting the human species to take the next step. The reeds in the marsh were thicker than ever. The silt was deeper, the sun was warmer. All the elements were in place. The cradle was no longer empty. It was full of the energy and ambition of a species that had finally found its footing. The mystery of Sumer is often portrayed as an overnight appearance of a complex society, but when we look through the lens of paleo-anthropology, we see that it was the culmination of thousands of years of silent preparation. It was the moment when the biography of the body and the biography of the earth finally aligned. The traits we had carried through the long Paleolithic night, our curiosity, our sociality, our manual skill, were finally given a stage large enough to contain them. The Cathedral of Silence was about to be replaced by the Cathedral of the City. We must also consider the cost of the dream for the environment. As we began to stack stone upon stone, we began to distance ourselves from the natural world. The ancient laws of the wolf and the deer no longer applied to us. We were beginning to create our own laws, our own rhythms. This was the start of the Anthropocene, the era where human activity became the dominant force on the planet. The ghosts in the landscape were becoming the architects of the landscape. And as we look back from our modern vantage point, we can see that this transition was both our greatest triumph and our most profound loss. In the final hours before the first dawn, the world of the wanderer was still there, but it was fading like a dream upon waking. The great herds still roamed the distant plains, and the fires of the last nomads still flickered in the mountains. But the center of gravity had shifted. The future was now being written in the mud of the delta. The Tigris and the Euphrates were no longer just rivers. They were the boundaries of a new reality. And as the first light of civilization began to touch the horizon, it didn't just illuminate the bricks of the first temples. It illuminated the human face, a face that was now marked by the weight of responsibility, the thrill of discovery, and the ancient, enduring hope for a better tomorrow. The silent witness of the soul had finally found its voice. The spark that had not yet been struck was now a roaring fire, and the world would never be silent in quite the same way again. The suspension was over. The journey had begun. In the deep velvet stillness of the world's memory, there exists a place where the geography of the earth and the biography of the human spirit finally intersected. Picture, if you will, the end of the Pleistocene, a time when the great white weight of the ice was beginning to lift from the shoulders of the northern continents. The world was waking from a slumber that had lasted 100,000 years, a long and crystalline winter that had dictated every breath, every footstep, and every heartbeat of our species. For eons, We had been a people of the perimeter, moving along the edges of the shifting frost, our lives a delicate dance with scarcity. But as the planet began to tilt toward a new light, a profound transformation was stirring in the heart of the Near East. The air, once sharp and thin with the scent of frozen stone, began to soften. It became thick, heavy, and fragrant with the musk of thawing earth. In this humid twilight, the Fertile Crescent exhaled its first breath of moist life, and the landscape began to pulse with a new and strange potential. At the center of this awakening were two great liquid veins, the Tigris and the Euphrates, surging with the melt water of distant, jagged peaks, carrying within their currents the very blueprints of our destiny. These rivers were not merely bodies of water. They were the lifeblood of a future yet unimagined. They were ancient travelers themselves, having journeyed across the rugged highlands of Anatolia, carving through the limestone and the basalt to bring the concentrated power of 1,000 miles down into the flat, expectant plains of Mesopotamia. As the sun beat down upon the silt-choked deltas, it created a haze of heat and gold, a watery labyrinth where the boundaries between the sky, the earth, and the water seemed to dissolve. This was the stage being set, a humid cradle of reeds and mud that offered a silent invitation to the wandering tribes of the Paleolithic. To look upon these waters was to witness the pulse of the planet itself, a rhythmic flooding that deposited a rich and dark bounty upon the banks. This silt was a sacred gift, a collection of minerals and mountain secrets gathered over eons, pulverized into a fine, fertile dust that held the promise of an abundance the world had never known. For the human body, this environment was a radical departure from the harsh, dry savannas and the biting winds of the tundra. Our ancestors arrived as the silent witnesses of a nomadic age, their frames lean and hardened by 1,000,000 miles of walking. Their feet, wide and calloused, had been designed by evolution to be restless. To walk was to live. To stay was to die. This was the ancient law written in our marrow. The human leg, with its long stride and its spring-loaded tendons, was a masterpiece of endurance, a biological weapon forged to chase the horizon and outrun the heat. For generations beyond counting, our skin had been a map of the elements, scarred by the thorns of the scrubland and darkened by the unrelenting sun of the Great Rift Valley. We were a species of the open road, our minds attuned to the shifting of the stars and the migration of the herds. But as the wandering tribes moved into the humid embrace of the Mesopotamian marshes, they felt a new sensation, a strange and seductive gravity that whispered of a different kind of survival. The air in the delta was heavy with the scent of ripening grasses and damp earth, a sensory tapestry that pulled at the very center of the human brain. Here, the silent error in our genetic code, the capacity for imagination and the yearning for permanence, found its perfect catalyst. Imagine a group of hunters emerging from the dry, dusty hills into the lush, emerald expanse of the reed beds. The crunch of dry grass beneath their feet was replaced by the soft, yielding squelch of the silt. It was a texture of luxury, a soil that felt alive against the skin. They saw the wild barley and the einkorn wheat standing tall and golden, swaying in the breeze with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace. In this moment, the spear, that ancient extension of the human arm, felt suddenly heavy and obsolete. The hand, which for 50,000 years had been a claw for clutching flint and wood, began to relax. The fingers, sensitive and inquisitive, reached out to touch the grain, sensing in its hard, sun-warmed shell a concentrated energy that could sustain a life without the constant, terrifying chase. This was the beginning of the biography of the hand in its most transformative chapter. The hand is perhaps the most poetic part of the human story, a collection of 27 small bones and a web of nerves that connect the mind directly to the physical world. In the wild, the hand was a survival tool of brutal precision. It gripped the club, it hurled the rock, it butchered the carcass in the fading light. But in the humid cradle of the twin veins, the hand began to learn the art of the gentle touch. It learned to gather without destroying. It learned to cradle the seed as if it were a tiny, sleeping god. This shift was not merely a change in behavior. It was a rewiring of our destiny. The cost of this adaptation would be high, the loss of the nomad's freedom, the introduction of back-breaking labor, and the eventual crowding of the soul, but the survival advantage was undeniable. The seed offered a way to cheat the seasons, to store the sun's energy in a clay jar, and to build a wall against the coming of the winter. As the tribes began to pause, the era of the wanderer did not end with a shout, but with a ripple, a slow, collective consciousness that spread through the tall reeds like a ghost. This was the birth of the community as we know it. In the open wilderness, the group was small, a fragile circle of kin held together by the campfire. But the abundance of the marshlands allowed the circles to grow, to overlap, and to merge. The silence of the primeval forest was replaced by the low melodic murmur of 1,000 voices living in close proximity. This was a biological miracle and a social crisis combined. The human brain, evolved to manage the complex relationships of a few dozen people, was suddenly forced to navigate the presence of hundreds. We had to develop a new kind of invisible anatomy, the structures of law, ritual, and hierarchy to keep the peace in this crowded paradise. The silent memory carved in bone was now being augmented by the vibrant memory of the collective, as we began to tell stories not just of where we had been, but of where we would stay. Consider a single night in this transitional world. A fire burns low on the edge of the Euphrates. The air is cool, and the sound of the water lapping against the mud is a constant rhythmic heartbeat. A man sits by the flames, his hands stained dark by the silt he has been working all day. He is no longer looking at the horizon for the movement of the gazelle. He is looking at the ground. He is thinking about the grain he buried in the moist earth and the way the sun and water will transform it. This is a new kind of dreaming, a sedentary dream. Behind him, the first primitive shelters of reed and mud rise from the earth, looking like strange, oversized nests. They are the first marks of permanence, the first scars of human will upon the landscape. The stars above are the same stars his ancestors followed across the deserts, but to him, they have a new meaning. They are the markers of the harvest, the celestial clock that tells him when the rivers will rise and when the earth will give up its bounty. The evolutionary duality of this moment is profound. By laying down the spear and taking up the seed, we were trading the health of the nomad for the security of the farmer. The bones of these first settlers tell a story of struggle. Archaeologists, digging through the layers of time, find that the transition to agriculture brought a decline in height, a weakening of the joints, and the first signs of nutritional deficiency and dental decay. The human frame was not designed to bend over a hoe for 12 hours a day, nor was the human digestive system prepared for a diet dominated by a single grain. We were becoming slaves of the soil, tethered to a patch of earth that required constant vigilance. Yet the trade-off was a population explosion. A single acre of wheat could support far more lives than 1,000 acres of wilderness. We were choosing the survival of the many over the vitality of the few. It was a biological gamble of cosmic proportions, a silent error that would eventually allow us to build cities, write poetry, and reach for the moon. The twin veins of the Tigris and Euphrates were the silent partners in this gamble. They were volatile and capricious, their floods often arriving with a violence that could sweep away a decade of work in a single afternoon. To live here was to live in a state of perpetual negotiation with the water. This was the adaptation versus cost in its most physical form. To survive, the humans had to do something no species had ever done. They had to reorganize the earth itself. They began to dig the first canals, small, shallow trenches that bled the river's energy into the dry patches of the delta. This was the first engineering of the planet's surface, a moment where the human hand and the river's vein became a single system. Each shovelful of mud moved was a statement of defiance against the randomness of nature. We were no longer just living in the world. We were building one. As the generations faded into the dust, the connection between the people and the rivers deepened into something sacred. The water was seen as a living force, a god that could bring life or death with the turn of a season. The Cathedral of Silence was becoming a cathedral of ritual. The first temples were not made of stone, but of the very reeds that grew in the marshes, elegant, towering structures of woven stalks that mirrored the shape of the river's flow. Inside these reed sanctuaries, the first priests began to codify the relationship between the people, the earth, and the divine. They were the keepers of the collective consciousness, the ones who remembered the cycles of the floods and the movements of the planets. They were the ones who turned the sensory invitation of the landscape into a religious mandate. The era of the wanderer was drawing to a close, but its legacy remained in our bodies. Even today, we carry the restlessness of the nomad in our DNA. We feel it in our desire to travel, in our fascination with the horizon, and in the phantom itch of the feet that have been still for too long. But we also carry the legacy of the delta, the need for community, the desire for permanence, and the deep, subconscious comfort we find in the sound of running water and the smell of damp earth. We are the children of the confluence, a species born of the tension between the road and the home. The humid cradle of the Near East was the place where we finally stopped running and began to build the world we see around us today. Imagine the last true nomad of that age, standing on a hill overlooking the growing settlements of the delta. He sees the smoke of 100 fires rising into the twilight. He hears the sound of children laughing and the rhythmic thud of the first grain grinders. He feels the pull of that ancient, wandering freedom in his chest, the urge to turn his back on the valley and follow the sunset into the high, dry plains. But then he smells the roasting grain and the sweetness of the marsh air. He sees the golden promise of the silt and the shimmering beauty of the twin veins. He realizes that the world has changed. The silence has been broken. The stage being set is no longer empty, and the actors have taken their places for a drama that will span 5,000 years. With a sigh that is both a goodbye and a greeting, he descends into the valley, his footsteps heavy with the weight of a destiny he cannot yet name. He lays down his spear at the edge of the water, reaches into the mud to pick up a single seed, And in that simple, quiet act, the history of civilization begins. As the dusk deepens into a starry Mesopotamian night, the two great rivers continue their tireless journey toward the sea. They carry the mountain snows, the mineral dust, and the hopes of a new kind of creature. The reeds sway in the darkness, whispering the secrets of the future to the silt. The air is still heavy with the scent of the promise. The world is no longer in suspension, it is in motion. The confluence of the twin veins has become the confluence of human ambition and natural abundance. The cradle is rocking, and the child of civilization is finally waking up. The transition from the wild, flickering uncertainty of the Paleolithic to the towering certainty of the city did not happen with a whisper, but with the sudden jarring clarity of a sunburst cutting through 1,000,000 years of fog. For eons, the human story was written in the most fragile of materials. The smell of wood smoke on a nomadic wind, the fleeting imprint of a bare foot on a riverbank, the echoing silence of a cave. We were creatures of the seasonal rhythm, ghosts who drifted across the Pleistocene landscape, following the migration of the bison and the reindeer, never daring to leave a permanent mark upon the earth. But then, in the mud-slicked delta of Mesopotamia, something shifted within the collective mind. A subtle error in the ancient code of life, a sudden yearning for the vertical. Picture, if you will, the world as it was 10,000 years ago. A vast, flat expanse of reeds and silt where the horizon offered no shelter and the sky felt overwhelmingly infinite. It was here, in this watery labyrinth, that the impossible occurred. As if a veil had been torn away by an unseen hand, the wandering tribes ceased their drifting. They turned their gaze downward toward the river's silt and upward toward the stars. And in that confluence, they birthed the first geometry of the soul. The mud brick is a humble object, yet it is perhaps the most revolutionary character in the biography of the human body. To understand its power, we must first look at the hand that made it. For millions of years, the human hand had been a weapon of survival. It was forged in the heat of the African savanna to grasp the rough bark of the acacia, to huddle against the cold of the Ice Age, and to strike the flint until it yielded a razor-sharp edge. The palm was a map of scars, callous and hard, designed for the grab and the kill. But as the first Sumerians knelt in the damp clay of the Euphrates, the hand underwent a spiritual metamorphosis. It began to feel the weight of the city. The fingers, once used to butcher the gazelle, now learned to press wet earth into wooden frames, creating the first uniform units of human ambition. This was the birth of the brick, the moment when we realized that the world was not just something to be endured, but something to be assembled. Each brick was a captured piece of the earth, a solidified dream, a testament to a new kind of human will that sought to stand tall against the infinite crushing sky. The arrival of the city defies the slow, agonizing crawl of traditional evolution. In the fossil record, we see the agonizingly slow sharpening of the spear point over hundreds of thousands of years, yet the city of Eridu appears as if it had been inherited from a dream. There is a terrifying confidence in these first urban dwellers. They did not seem to struggle through centuries of trial and error to understand the mathematics of the arch or the structural integrity of the wall. They built with an instinctive, haunting precision. Imagine a day in the life of a master mason at the dawn of Uruk. The air is heavy with the scent of damp silt and the metallic tang of the river. He does not see the mud as a nuisance. He sees it as the skin of a god. He moves with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace, laying courses of brick as if he is reciting a prayer. His back aches with a new kind of pain, not the acute agony of the hunt, but the dull, chronic throb of the builder. This is the evolutionary cost of the city. We traded the agile, spring-loaded spine of the hunter for the stooped, enduring frame of the laborer. We sacrificed the freedom of the horizon for the security of the corner. As the first walls rose, the silent witness of the earth recorded this transformation with a start. For billions of years, the planet had known only the curves of nature, the meander of the river, the swell of the hill, the circle of the nest. Suddenly, the landscape was scarred by the straight lines of irrigation and the sharp 90-degree angles of the home. These were the first artificial mountains. In the flat, featureless plains of Sumer, the ziggurat began its climb toward the heavens. These were not mere buildings. They were anchors for the human spirit, reaching up to touch the hem of the gods. Picture the sheer scale of the labor. Thousands of men and women moving in a synchronized dance of mud and straw, their heavy footprints treading the first urban paths. They were no longer a collection of families. They were a collective consciousness, a superorganism directed by a single architectonic vision. This was the sudden architecture of the soul, a leap across the chasm of time that rewrote our destiny in a single feverish generation. The duality of this adaptation is found in the tension between survival and vulnerability. The city offered a fortress against the predator and the storm, but it created a new kind of fragility. Within these walls, we became dependent on a complex web of strangers. If the irrigation lines failed, if the grain rotted, if a hidden sickness bloomed in the crowded streets, the entire dream could collapse. We were no longer part of the wild, governed by the ancient laws of the wolf. We were governed by the laws of the ledger and the priest. Yet the advantage was undeniable. The city became a pressurized chamber for the mind. Surrounded by the geometry of the brick, the human intellect began to bloom. The need to count the harvest led to the first marks on clay. The need to align the temple led to the first maps of the stars. We were no longer just living in the world. We were measuring it, naming it, and ultimately trying to rule it. Generations faded into the dust of the delta, yet the trait remained. The urge to build, to stack stone upon stone, to leave a mark that the wind cannot erase, is now etched into our very marrow. We see the legacy of that first Sumerian sunburst in the glass towers of our modern metropolises. We carry the same geometry of the soul that led an ancient ancestor to press his hand into a block of wet mud and realize he could change the world. The silence of the primeval world was gone forever, replaced by the roar of the city, a sound that has not ceased for 5,000 years. We are the children of the brick, the heirs to an overnight awakening that took a species of ghosts and turned them into the masters of the architecture of time. In the deep velvet hush of the prehistoric world, long before the first city rose from the silt, there was a silence that defined the human condition. For millions of years, the mind of man was a brilliant, flickering flame contained within the bone walls of the skull, unable to spill out into the world in any lasting form. We were creatures of the breath and the gesture, our histories as fleeting as the wood smoke that drifted from the fires of the Great Rift Valley. In that era of the long Paleolithic night, a thought was a ghost. It lived only as long as the voice that spoke it or the memory that held it. When a storyteller died in the darkness of a cave in the Pleistocene, a library of wisdom vanished with their final exhalation. The crunch of snow beneath the feet of hunters in Doggerland, the heat of the African sun, the frantic beating of a heart during the chase. These were sensory truths that disappeared into the void of deep time, leaving no trace for the children who would follow. The universe was vast, terrifying, and unnamed, a chaotic tapestry of phenomena that we could observe but never truly capture. But then, as the Neolithic revolution began to settle our restless feet into the mud-slicked deltas of Mesopotamia, a profound and silent error occurred in the code of life. It was not a mutation of the bone or the muscle, but a mutation of the hand's intent. Consider the hand, this exquisite character in our biological play, with its 27 delicate bones, and its web of nerves that connect the firing neurons of the brain to the physical matter of the earth. For eons, the hand was a weapon of survival. It was forged to grip the rough, cold texture of flint, to butcher the mammoth, and to huddle for warmth. But in the humid warmth of the Sumerian marshes, the hand found a new, sacred purpose. It found the reed. The reed was a simple thing, a hollow stalk of phragmites swaying in the endless breeze of the wetlands, a plant that had existed long before the first primate stood upright. Yet in the hand of an ancestor whose mind had been sharpened by the pressures of a growing society, this reed became something more. It became a bridge. Imagine a day in the life of such an ancestor. Let us call him a witness to the dawn. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and ripening barley. The sun is a golden weight upon his shoulders. He sits by the edge of a slow-moving canal, a tablet of wet, gray clay resting on his knees. This clay is the very flesh of the river, the sacred silt that had traveled 1,000 miles from the mountains to reach him. He takes a single reed, sharpens its tip with a flake of obsidian, and for the first time in the history of the planet, he presses a thought into the world. In that singular moment, the ephemeral nature of the human spirit was captured and frozen in time forever. The stroke of the reed into the clay was the birth of Cuneiform, a language of wedges and lines that gave a permanent voice to the silent centuries. It was not a slow, stuttering evolution of simple drawings. It emerged with a sudden, sophisticated intensity, a vessel designed to hold the weight of a civilization. This was the mutation that truly separated us from the wild. Before the reed, we were part of the landscape's rhythm. After the reed, we were its recorders. We began to name the universe, and in naming it, we claimed power over it. The reed, once a humble plant of the marsh, became the scepter of a new kind of king, the scribe. As the stylus moved, the biology of the human eye underwent its own transformation. Our vision, evolved in the dappled light of the forest to detect the subtle movement of a leopard's tail, was now being trained to decipher the minute geometry of the wedge. This was the evolutionary duality of the written word. The survival advantage was immense. We could now store information outside our own bodies, creating a collective memory that could outlive our flesh. We could account for the grain in the granary, ensuring that the tribe would not starve when the rivers turned treacherous. But the cost was a new kind of vulnerability. We began to rely on the record more than the instinct. We moved from the oral tradition, where every story was a living, breathing performance, to the permanence of the word, where the law was as cold and unyielding as the baked clay. The Sumerians cataloged their world with a feverish, almost desperate intensity. They wrote of the gods, those capricious masters of the flood and the storm. They mapped the stars, tracing the silent errors of the planets across the velvet sky. and they recorded the mundane accounts of the price of a loaf of bread. They were weaving a tapestry of data that anchored their society to the physical world, creating a reality that was no longer just felt, but documented. The fear of the dark, once a primal terror of the predator, was slowly replaced by a fear of the unknown, the unrecorded. If a thing was not written, did it truly exist? Imagine the scribe at night, working by the flickering amber light of an oil lamp. The smell of wood smoke still lingers in the air, a sensory link to his nomadic ancestors. But his world is now defined by the boundaries of the city wall and the margins of the tablet. His fingers are stained with the river's mud, and his eyes are tired from tracing the wedges of destiny. He is writing a poem, perhaps the first ever composed, reflecting on the beauty of the goddess Inanna or the tragedy of a lost friend. As he presses the reed into the clay, he is performing an act of biological defiance. He is ensuring that his voice will reach across the chasm of 5,000 years to touch our own ears. He is the first ghost in the machine, the first human to achieve a form of immortality that does not depend on the reproduction of his DNA, but on the preservation of his ideas. Generations faded into the dust, and the cities of Sumer eventually crumbled back into the silt from which they rose. The great ziggurats became mounds of weathered brick, and the canals were choked by the desert sands. Yet, the gift of the sacred reed remained. The mutation of the hand had become a permanent part of the human story. We see its legacy in every stroke of a pen, every tap on a keyboard, and every law etched into the consciousness of a modern nation. We are the children of the scribe, the heirs to a world that was named and organized by a sharpened stalk of grass. The transition from the wild to the word was a journey across a silent sea. And as the ice retreated and the forests gave way to the fields, we carried with us that first tablet, a silent witness to our origins, a memory carved not in bone, but in the very earth itself. The reed had taught us that while our bodies are fragile and our lives are short, our stories, once captured, can endure as long as the world has eyes to read them. In the deep, velvet stillness of the world's memory, there exists a time before the ticking of the clock, before the dividing of the circle, when the night sky was not a map, but a chaotic and terrifying abyss. Picture, if you will, our ancestors huddled in the dark of the Pleistocene, looking upward with eyes that were biologically indistinguishable from our own, yet seeing a fundamentally different universe. To the wanderer of the Ice Age, the stars were flickering spirits, or the distant cold eyes of predators waiting beyond the firelight. The night was a predatory thing, a vast, unmeasured void that swallowed the horizon and offered no guidance but the pale, erratic light of a moon that changed its face without explanation. In the crunch of snow beneath the feet of a nomadic tribe, or the rustle of the African savanna, the passage of time was marked only by the slow, grinding transition of the seasons or the visceral hunger in the belly. There was no minute, no hour, no degree. There was only the now, an eternal, shimmering present that stretched from the first light of dawn to the final doused coal of the evening fire. But then, as the great glaciers retreated and the fertile silt of the Near East began to host the first permanent cities, a new kind of silence descended upon the human spirit. In the humid, heavy air of Mesopotamia, the human eye, that exquisite character in our biological biography, began to perform a new and sacred task. For millions of years, the eye had been a weapon of survival. It was forged to detect the subtle ripple of a leopard in the tall grass, to gauge the distance of a throwing spear, and to navigate the treacherous dappled shadows of the forest. Its anatomy was a record of the grab and the kill, a high-resolution instrument designed to keep the body alive in a world of immediate physical threats. But under the obsidian canopy of the Sumerian night, the eye underwent a spiritual metamorphosis. It stopped looking for the predator in the shadows and began to look for the pattern in the fire. Imagine a priest astronomer standing atop the first primitive rise of a ziggurat in the city of Eridu. The air is thick with the scent of damp reeds and the cooling mud of the Euphrates. The city below is a hum of low voices and the smell of wood smoke. But up here, there is only the wind. The priest's eye, weary from the day's labor of measuring grain and adjudicating the disputes of a growing populace, turns upward. In this moment, the silent error in the code of life, the human obsession with order, finds its ultimate canvas. He looks at the stars and does not see a scatter of random sparks. He sees a clockwork of divine intent. He notices that certain lights move with a steady, wandering grace, while others remain fixed in a glittering geometry that returns year after year with a fidelity that defies the chaos of the earth. This was the birth of the geometry of the heavens, a sudden, elegant revelation that would rewrite the destiny of our species. The Sumerians were the first to realize that the universe possessed a heartbeat, a rhythmic pulse that could be translated into the language of number and ratio. They did not discover this mathematics through a slow, agonizing crawl of logic. It arrived with the force of an architectural vision. They looked at the sun's journey across the sky and divided its path into 12 houses, mirroring the 12 cycles of the moon. They looked at the horizon, the perfect circle of the world, and saw that it could be divided into 360 degrees, a number so harmonious, so divisible by the sacred integers of their base 60 system, that it seemed whispered into their ears by the gods themselves. This shift from the nomadic now to the urban measured time was an evolutionary duality of profound consequence. The survival advantage was staggering. By mapping the steady pulse of the constellations, the Sumerians created the first bridge of numbers between the mud of the earth and the fire of the stars. They synchronized the labor of the farmer with the cycles of the infinite. They knew, with a precision that seemed supernatural, exactly when the Tigris would surge with the mountain snows and when the soil would be thirsty for the seed. The calendar was a weapon against famine, a way to anchor the fragile human community to the reliable clockwork of the cosmos. But the cost was a new and permanent vulnerability. We began to live not in the rhythm of our own bodies, but in the rhythm of the machine we had discovered. We became the servants of the schedule, the inhabitants of the hour. We traded the wild, spontaneous freedom of the hunter for the regimented, ticking life of the citizen. Consider the biography of the hand as it moved from the flint knapper's strike to the scribe's meticulous drawing of the circle. To divide the circle into 60 parts required a level of manual dexterity and cognitive abstraction that had no precedent in the wild. The human hand, which for 50,000 years had been a claw for clutching and a fist for striking, was now tasked with the delicate geometry of the heavens. Each line drawn in the wet clay was a testament to a new kind of human will, a desire to capture the infinite and hold it in the palm. This mathematics was not a dry science, it was a mirror of the earth. The Sumerians believed that, as it was above, so it was below. The order they saw in the stars was a template for the order they sought to build in their streets. The city was meant to be a terrestrial reflection of the celestial plane, a place where the chaos of human existence could be tamed by the same laws that govern the wandering planets. Every time we look at a watch in the modern world, every time we glance at the time on a glowing screen, we are echoing the heartbeat of ancient Sumer. We carry their 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours in our pockets like a sacred inheritance. It is an ancient accident that rewrote our destiny, a mutation of culture that has become as essential to our survival as the opposable thumb. Generations have faded into the dust of the Delta, and the great libraries of Nippur and Ur have been swallowed by the sand. Yet the geometry remains. The bridge of numbers still stands. In the silence of the desert night, those first astronomers did more than just count stars. They invented the future. They took the terrifying, unmeasured abyss of the night and turned it into a map, a guide, and a promise. They realized that by understanding the ratio, they could predict the return of the light. They taught us that while our flesh is made of the river's mud, our minds are capable of grasping the fire of the heavens. As you drift into sleep tonight, imagine the velvet canopy of Mesopotamia stretching over you, and hear the slow, rhythmic ticking of a clock that began to beat 5,000 years ago in the heart of a silent, starlit city. Deep in the breathless quiet of the world's midwinter, before the first geometry of a brick had ever been pressed from the mud, the earth was a place of wild, unmeasured waters. Picture, if you will, the vast and lonely reaches of the Pleistocene, a landscape where the only map was the wind, and the only law was the erratic rhythm of the seasons. For tens of thousands of years, our ancestors lived as captives of the current. They huddled in the limestone shadows of the Zagros Mountains or drifted like smoke across the high, dry plateaus, watching the great rivers from a distance with eyes that held both reverence and a primitive, bone-deep terror. To the nomadic hunter, the river was not a resource, it was a god. It was a massive, unthinking beast of liquid silt that could give life in a shimmering pool of fish or take it away in a sudden, thundering surge of spring snowmelt. There was no mastery, no command, only the desperate, seasonal migration to follow the retreating water and the frantic flight when the banks dissolved into a brown, swirling chaos. In this era of the long Paleolithic night, the human body was a masterpiece of the perimeter. Our legs were built for the long walk, for the tireless pursuit across the savanna, but they were not yet braced for the heavy, stationary toil of the earth mover. Our hands were designed to grip the cold, sharp edge of a flint blade or to huddle against the warmth of the first fires, but they had not yet learned to feel the collective weight of the silt. But then, as the great ice sheets retreated into the northern mists and the world exhaled a breath of humid heat, a subtle shift began to ripple through the human spirit, a silent error in the ancient code of life that whispered of a different kind of survival. We began to look at the river not as a god to be fled, but as a current to be bent. Consider the biography of the arm, that exquisite lever of bone and muscle that had spent 1,000,000 years throwing spears and climbing trees. As the first Sumerians descended from the foothills and set their feet upon the flat, sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, the arm underwent a spiritual and physical metamorphosis. It began to feel the invisible current. The ancestors realized that the water, which flowed with such indifferent power toward the Persian Gulf, carried within it the very lifeblood of the future. But to claim it, they had to perform a miracle of fluid grace. They had to reorganize the very surface of the planet. Imagine a day in the life of such a pioneer, an ancestor standing at the edge of the wild Euphrates 10,000 years ago. The sun is a scorching weight upon his shoulders, and the air is thick with the scent of damp reeds and the metallic tang of the river. Around him, the land is a study in extremes, the gray, parched dust of the desert throat choking for a drop of moisture, while just yards away, the river surges with a wasted abundance. In his mind, a new geometry is forming. He does not see the river as a barrier. He sees it as a vein. He kneels in the mud, his hands, those ancient tools of the hunt, digging into the silt. This is the first strike of a new kind of war. He is not hunting a beast. He is hunting the flow. This was the birth of the first great engineering of the earth, a moment when the human species ceased to be a ghost in the landscape and became its architect. It began with a single shallow trench, a silent accident of curiosity that allowed a trickle of water to escape the main channel and wander into the thirsty dust. But as the trickle became a stream, and the stream became a canal, the biology of the human community began to change. This was the adaptation versus cost in its most visceral form. To master the water, the individual had to be sacrificed for the many. A single man could not dig a canal, he could only dig a grave. To bend the river, thousands of hands had to move in unison. They had to work with a rhythmic precision, a social cohesion that had never before existed in the history of the primates. This collective sacrifice was the mutation of the soul that allowed Sumer to bloom. Picture the scene at the height of the digging season. A line of workers stretching as far as the eye can see, their backs stooped in the heat, their rhythmic chanting providing a heartbeat for the labor. There is no modern slang here, no fast pacing, only the slow, agonizing thud of the wooden spade into the heavy, wet clay. They are digging the veins of the earth so that the city might breathe. Each basket of earth carried away is a testament to a new kind of human will, a desire to turn the gray wasteland into a verdant emerald sea of barley and wheat. As the canals grew and the levees rose, the chaotic force of destruction was tamed. The water was led into a watery labyrinth of sluices and gates, becoming a disciplined servant that arrived exactly when the seed was ready. This was the survival advantage that rewrote our destiny. The caloric wealth provided by the controlled flood was so immense that it fueled the rise of a new kind of human being. For the first time, there was a surplus. There was enough grain to feed the man who did not dig, the man who instead sat in the shade of a temple and mapped the stars, or the man who sat by a wheel and shaped the first pots, or the king who sat on a throne and dreamt of empire. But this mastery came with a heavy cost, a vulnerability etched into the bones of the city dwellers. We see it in the archaeological record. The spines of the canal diggers are fused and scarred by the repetitive strain of the basket carry. Their teeth are worn by the grit of the silt that found its way into every loaf of bread. They had traded the agile, free-roaming health of the hunter for the stooped, sedentary life of the irrigator. And more than that, they had become dependent. If the canal choked with silt, if the levee broke in the night, the city would die. They were no longer masters of their own movement. They were captives of the system they had built. They had created an invisible current of social obligation that bound every citizen to the river and to each other. And as the ice retreated further into the forgotten past, the landscape of Sumer became a shimmering mirror of human ambition. From the top of a ziggurat, the view was no longer a desolate desert, but a tapestry of green and gold, sliced by the silver lines of the canals. The air was heavy with the scent of ripening grain and the humidity of the managed marsh. The silence of the primeval world was gone, replaced by the sound of the water wheel and the distant melodic calls of the workers in the fields. This was the first unnatural environment, a reorganization of nature to serve the hunger of the many. The master of the invisible current remains within us today. We see the legacy of those first Sumerian diggers in the massive dams that span our rivers and the pipes that carry water to our desert cities. Every time we turn a tap and expect the water to flow, we are echoing the confidence of the first irrigator who believed he could command the Euphrates. We carry the social cohesion of the canal diggers in our laws and our taxes, in our collective sacrifice for the survival of the state. We are the heirs to a world that was dug out of the mud by thousands of hands working in unison, a world where the invisible current of the river became the invisible current of civilization itself. Generations have faded into the dust, and the great canals of and Lagash are now nothing but faint scars on the face of the desert, visible only from the air. The gray dust has returned to much of the land, and the emerald sea has receded. Yet, the silent memory carved in bone remains. We remember the feeling of the silt between our toes and the weight of the water in our hands. We remember the time when we first looked at the wild, chaotic world and decided that we would be its masters. And as the sun sets over the modern ruins of the Near East, the twin rivers still flow, carrying the mountain snows and the secrets of the ancients toward the sea, waiting for the next generation of dreamers to find the current and bend it once more. In the deep, velvet stillness of the world's memory, there exists a shadow that neither the sun of the Near East nor the light of modern science has ever fully dispelled. Picture, if you will, the Earth as it was before the concept of an outsider even existed, a time when the Pleistocene gave way to a new and humid warmth, and the Great Rift Valley had already sent its children wandering into the far corners of the globe. For millennia, the human story followed a predictable, echoing rhythm. Tribes moved, genetic markers drifted like pollen on the wind, and languages branched out like the slow, deliberate growth of an ancient oak. We can trace the footsteps of the Semitic peoples, the Indo-Europeans, and the nomads of the north as they shifted across the landscape, their DNA leaving a trail of breadcrumbs in the soil. But as we turn our gaze to the marshy deltas where the Tigris and Euphrates meet the sea, we encounter a profound and haunting silence. We find a people who seem to have stepped out of a mist, unmoored from the family tree of the world. They called themselves the Sag-giga, the black-headed ones, and they remain to this day the ultimate linguistic and biological island in the vast sea of human history. To understand the mystery of the black-headed people, we must look at the biography of the face, specifically the eyes and the brow, those silent witnesses that have been carved into stone for 5,000 years. When we look at the votive statues recovered from the ruins of and Eridu, we do not see the squinted gaze of a hunter-gatherer scanning the horizon for a predator. Instead, we see eyes that are impossibly wide, fixed in a stare of perpetual sacred wonder. These are eyes that have seen the Anunnaki, the ones who from heaven came and have never quite recovered from the vision. In the Paleolithic, the eye was a character of survival, narrowed to protect against the glare of the sun or the sting of the wind, focused on the immediate, visceral reality of the hunt. But the Sumerian eye was a character of revelation. It was wide because it was drinking in a world that had been suddenly, and perhaps unnaturally, expanded. The Sumerians did not seem to be discovering civilization. They seemed to be remembering it from a dream that no one else was having. Imagine a day in the life of a traveler from a neighboring Semitic tribe, a wanderer whose ancestors had slowly adapted to the harsh, dry plateaus over 10,000 years. He descends into the lush, humid delta and encounters the black-headed ones for the first time. The sensory contrast is jarring. He smells the heavy, sweet musk of the managed marshes and the metallic tang of the first bronze workshops. But it is the people themselves who feel alien. Their language does not share a single root with his own. Its grammar is a labyrinth of logic that seems to have no parent and no siblings in the linguistic record. It is a language isolate, a silent error in the code of human communication that appeared fully formed, as if dropped from the stars. As he walks the streets of Eridu, he sees a people who do not just occupy the landscape, but who possess it with a quiet, terrifying dignity. They carry the sacred knowledge of irrigation, geometry, and the written word not as hard-won discoveries, but as a gifted inheritance. To the outsider, they are stewards of a secret that makes the very earth obey them. The duality of this existence, this being a people set apart, carried a profound evolutionary cost. To be an island in a sea of strangers is to live in a state of perpetual vulnerability. The black-headed ones were surrounded by tribes whose bones and tongues were deeply rooted in the surrounding soil, while they themselves felt like guests in their own cradle. This created a biological and social pressure to maintain their distinctiveness, to keep the blackhead as a mark of a specific divine mission. They were the first to carry the heavy burden of being truly civilized, a weight that manifests in their art as a profound, stoic seriousness. They had traded the anonymity of the nomad for the visibility of the citizen. They were no longer ghosts in the landscape, they were the owners of the world, and every eye was upon them. Scientific discovery treats this as a puzzle of migration and genetics, but in the narrator's voice, it is a story of a lost encounter. Whether the Anunnaki were a poetic metaphor for the sudden spark of genius, or a memory of a culture that vanished beneath the rising tides of the Persian Gulf, the effect on the Sumerian soul was the same. They believed their blueprints came from elsewhere. In the silence of the genome, we search for the origin of the Sag-giga, looking for a match in the mountain tribes of the east or the seafaring peoples of the south. But the results remain inconclusive. They appear in the record like a sunburst, their culture arriving with a sophisticated architecture of the soul that defies the slow crawl of Neolithic progress. They built their ziggurats as artificial mountains, perhaps trying to replicate a home they could no longer find on the flat horizons of Mesopotamia. The biography of the bone in Sumerian cemeteries tells us that these were people of diverse origins who coalesced around a singular idea, yet their core identity remained stubbornly unique. As they walked the streets of Ur, their calloused feet treading on the first paved roads, they were experiencing the world in a way no human had ever before. They were the first to feel the fear of the record, the knowledge that their lives were being catalogued by the scribes, that their deeds were being weighed against the laws of the gods. This was a new kind of survival. Success was no longer just about outrunning the leopard. It was about maintaining one's place in the sacred order. The cost of this adaptation was the birth of anxiety, the first shadows of the urban psyche. Generations faded into the dust, and eventually, The black-headed ones were absorbed into the rising tides of the Akkadian and Babylonian empires. Their language, once the vibrant pulse of the Delta, retreated into the cold, silent halls of the temples, used only by priests for rituals they barely understood. Yet the trait remained. The Sumerian gaze, that wide-eyed look of wonder and responsibility, passed into the artistic DNA of the ancient world. We see it in the statues of the Greeks, in the icons of the East, and in our own mirror when we contemplate the vastness of our history. We are all, in some sense, the children of the Sag-giga, carrying a sacred knowledge of civilization that we did not earn, but inherited from a people who appeared from the mist to name the world. As you drift into the deep sleep of the night, imagine the streets of Eridu under a velvet sky. See the black-headed ones moving with a quiet, rhythmic grace through the shadows of the ziggurat. They are the silent witnesses of our beginning, the ones who first understood that to be human is to be a steward of the infinite. They carry the secret of the first dawn in their wide, staring eyes, and though their voices have been silenced by 5,000 years of silt, their dignity remains carved in the very bone of our history. The mystery of their origin is not a problem to be solved, but a sacred memory to be honored. A reminder that in the long, dark hallway of human time, some doors were opened by hands we can no longer name. In the deep, velvet hush of the prehistoric world, before the first geometry of the city had scarred the earth, the human experience was defined by the linear struggle of the steppe. Picture, if you will, the vast and lonely reaches of the Pleistocene, a landscape where the only map was the migration of the herd and the only engine was the slow, rhythmic contraction of the human muscle. For tens of thousands of years, our ancestors were creatures of the burden. From the scorched sun of the Great Rift Valley to the biting crystalline winds of the Ice Age tundra, the biology of the traveler was a story of weight. To be human was to carry. We carried our children against the heat of our chests. We carried the heavy, iron-scented carcasses of the hunt across the flint-strewn plains. We carried the very architecture of our lives on our aching spines. The world was vast, not because of its geography, but because of the friction of the earth. Every mile was earned in the marrow of the bone and the sweat of the brow. In this era of deep time, the horizon was a distant and jealous god, yielding only to the slow, punishing pace of the bipedal stride. But as the great ice sheets retreated into the northern mists and the humid warmth of the Neolithic revolution began to settle the restless feet of the wanderer, a silent revolution was stirring in the dust of the Mesopotamian workshop. It was here, in the hazy, sun-drenched deltas of Sumer, that the human mind encountered the circle. Consider the biography of the spine, that magnificent column of vertebrae that had spent 4 million years adapting to the vertical pressure of walking upright. It was a masterpiece of biological engineering, yet it had a limit, a threshold where the weight of the world became too great for the flesh to bear. The wheel arrived not as a sudden bolt of lightning, but as a subtle shift in the code of human intent, an ancient accident that began not as a means of transport, but as a servant of the hearth. Imagine a day in the life of a master artisan in the burgeoning streets of Eridu or Uruk. The air is heavy with the scent of damp river silt and the metallic tang of wood smoke. The artisan kneels in the shade of a reed awning, his hands, those exquisite characters of our history, forged for the grip of the spear, now caked in the gray, slick clay of the Euphrates. Before him sits a heavy disk of stone or wood. For generations, his ancestors had shaped clay by the slow, laborious movement of the hand around the vessel. But in a moment of elegant revelation, he realizes that the clay can remain still if the earth beneath it moves. He gives the disk a shove, and the circle begins to spin. This was the birth of the potter's wheel, the first time a human being harnessed the infinite, frictionless grace of the rotation. In that spinning disk, the artisan did not just shape a jar, he shaped the future. He discovered that the circle was the key to conquering the resistance of the physical world. The transition from the potter's workshop to the dusty roads of the plain was a leap across the chasm of the possible. The wheel, once a horizontal servant of the home, was tilted vertically and placed beneath the cart. It was the first mechanical extension of our own anatomy, a way to outsource the punishing labor of the back to the unyielding strength of the axle. This was the evolutionary duality of progress. The survival advantage was staggering, but the cost was a fundamental change in the pace of the human soul. The wheel shrank the world. It turned the weeks of a nomadic journey into the days of a merchant's transit. It allowed us to transport the massive, sun-baked stones of the ziggurats and the heavy golden harvests of the barley fields, creating a caloric and material wealth that could sustain thousands. The biography of the foot was rewritten. No longer was the human limited by the weight he could hoist upon his shoulders. He was now the pilot of the machine. But consider the sensory reality of this shift. Picture an ancestor who has lived his entire life in the slow, silent rhythm of the pedestrian. One afternoon, he witnesses the passage of the first wheeled cart. He hears a sound the wilderness had never known, the rhythmic, wooden groaning of the axle and the heavy grinding crunch of the wheel against the sun-hardened silt. It is a sound of power, a mechanical thunder that signals the end of the primeval silence. As the wheel turns, the pace of human history accelerates from a crawl to a gallop. The weight of progress was not just material, it was psychological. The wheel brought with it the machinery of war, the rolling thunder of the first chariots carving paths through the tall grasses of the wilderness. The same circle that carried the grain to the hungry also carried the soldier to the border. The landscape, once an obstacle to be respected, became a surface to be conquered and paved. This was a silent error in the code of life, a realization that we could move faster than the biological limits of our legs. The survival advantage allowed Sumer to expand its reach far beyond the humid cradle of the rivers, establishing trade routes that stretched to the Indus and the Mediterranean. But the vulnerability was equally profound. We became dependent on the road. We became a species that required infrastructure, maintenance, and the constant input of energy to keep the circles turning. If the axle snapped, the city starved. We had traded the resilient, self-contained autonomy of the nomad for the complex, fragile interconnectedness of the wheeled society. Generations faded into the dust of the Mesopotamian plains, and the wooden wheels of the Sumerians eventually rotted back into the earth. Yet the trait remained, etched into the very marrow of our civilization. We feel its legacy in every rotation of a modern turbine, in every spinning gear of a clock, and in the tires that hum across the asphalt of our distant century. We carry the mechanical memory of that first artisan who realized that the circle was the key to the horizon. The wheel did not just move our bodies, it moved our minds. It taught us to think in terms of efficiency, speed, and momentum. It turned the world into a series of distances to be overcome, rather than landscapes to be inhabited. As you drift into the deep, rhythmic stillness of sleep, Imagine the first wheel turning in the golden dust of a Sumerian evening. Hear the slow, steady creak of the wood and the soft whisper of the sand. It is a hypnotic sound, a heartbeat of human ambition that has not ceased for 5,000 years. We are the heirs to that simple, profound circle. We are the children of the gallop, still riding the momentum of a revolution that began in a humble workshop by the river. The weight of the world is still with us, but because of the wheel, we no longer have to carry it alone. The horizon is no longer a jealous god. It is merely the next turn of the circle, waiting to be reached. In the deep, velvet hush of the prehistoric world, before the first line was etched into the clay, the human conscience was a wild and untamed thing. Picture, if you will, the vast and lonely reaches of the Pleistocene, a landscape where the only judge was the wind and the only law was the visceral imperative of the bloodline. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors moved in small, tight-knit circles of kinship, bound together by the biological glue of shared DNA. In the flickering amber light of a Paleolithic campfire, justice was a matter of instinct and immediate consequence. If a hunter took more than his share of the reindeer meat, the tribal elder's rebuke was swift. If a stranger encroached upon the family's cave, the response was a flash of flint and the heat of a defensive strike. There were no strangers in this world, only brothers or enemies. The biography of the heart in these ancient days was written in the simple binary language of love for the pack and fear of the void. We were creatures of the primal tether, our moral compass limited to the few faces we had known since birth, while the rest of the world remained a dark and lawless mystery. But as the great ice sheets retreated, and the humid warmth of the Neolithic Revolution drew the nomadic tribes into the sun-drenched deltas of Mesopotamia, the biology of the human spirit encountered a crisis of scale. The cities of Sumer did not just grow, they fermented. Within the rising mud-brick walls of Uruk and Lagash, the simple bonds of kinship began to fray under the unprecedented weight of the crowd. For the first time in the history of the primates, the human mind evolved to track the nuances of perhaps 50 close relatives was suddenly forced to navigate the presence of 10,000 strangers. The air in the city was heavy with the scent of damp silt, roasting barley, and the sweat of a multitude. In the narrow, winding alleys, the silent error in the code of life became apparent. Our ancient tribal instincts were no longer enough to keep the peace. When two men who were not brothers argued over a boundary of irrigation silt, or when a merchant from a distant hill tribe felt cheated in the exchange of grain, the old laws of the bloodline offered only the chaos of the vendetta. Consider the biography of the conscience, that invisible organ of the mind that had spent millions of years refining the concept of fairness in the context of the small group. In the wild, fairness was the equal distribution of a kill. In the city, fairness became an abstract geometry. As the cities grew more crowded, the Sumerians realized that the heart of man required a new kind of tether, one that was not made of blood, but of the very clay beneath their feet. Thus, the first shadows of the law were cast upon the earth. It was a biological adaptation of the mind, a way to expand the circle of the hearth into a moral architecture that was as sturdy and permanent as the ziggurats. They began to formulate codes of justice that sought to protect the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, and the poor, establishing the revolutionary idea that the measure of a society was found in how it treated those who had no kinship to the powerful. Imagine a day in the life of a citizen in the city of Nippur, 4,000 years ago. The sun is a golden weight upon the flat roofs, and the distant sound of the stonecutter's chisel provides a rhythmic heartbeat to the morning. A woman, whose husband was lost to the seasonal fever of the marshes, stands before a gate. In the Paleolithic, her story would have ended in the quiet neglect of a tribe that could no longer carry her weight. But here, she seeks the shadow of the law. She appeals to a magistrate, a man who sits in the shade of a temple portico. He does not know her name. He does not share her blood. But on a tablet of wet clay beside him, the king's edicts are recorded in the sharp, uncompromising wedges of cuneiform. This is the birth of the idea that right could be might. The law acts as a second skin for the social body, a protective layer that allows strangers to live, work, and dream in close proximity without the constant threat of the spear. This shift was an evolutionary duality of staggering complexity. The survival advantage was the birth of the complex cooperative society, a superorganism that could build canals, raise armies, and store enough grain to withstand a 7-year drought. By harmonizing the conflicting desires of thousands, the law allowed for a specialization of the human body that the wilderness would never have permitted. One hand could focus solely on the artisan's wheel, another on the priest's incense, and another on the scribe's reed, because the law provided the security that they would not be struck down in their beds by a neighbor's greed. But the cost was the weight of the state. We traded the wild, spontaneous autonomy of the forest for the rigid, documented life of the subject. The conscience, once a fluid thing directed by empathy and immediate need, became a ledger of debts, penalties, and obligations. We were the first species to be governed not just by the laws of nature, but by the laws of the text. In the quiet, cool halls of the palace, the scribes moved with a deliberate, rhythmic grace. Their hands, caked in the gray silt of the river, were the instruments of this new moral order. As they recorded the royal edicts, they were ensuring that the whims of the powerful, the sudden anger of a king, or the greed of a governor, were checked by the permanence of the written word. This was the adaptation versus cost in its most enduring form. The written law offered a shield against tyranny, but it also created a bureaucracy of the soul. The biography of the eye was once again transformed. We were now a species that looked to the tablet to know what was good and just, rather than looking into the eyes of our kin. The sanctity of marriage, the disputes over property, and the precise penalties for injury were all frozen in the clay, creating a social contract that remains the foundation of our modern world. The first shadows of the law were not just rules for the city. They were a mirror of the heavens. The Sumerians believed that the order of the stars, the geometry of the heavens they had mapped so meticulously, required a terrestrial equivalent. A king's power was no longer derived from his ability to strike the hardest with a club, but from his role as a shepherd of the people, a title that appears again and again in the ancient inscriptions. He was the earthly representative of a divine justice that demanded balance. If a man broke another man's bone, the law demanded a specific, measured restitution, not an endless cycle of blood feud, but a price paid in silver or grain. This was the evolutionary invention of peace, a way to dampen the ancient predatory fires of the human heart so that the fires of the furnace and the kiln could burn instead. Generations faded into the dust of the delta, and the great cities of Sumer were eventually swallowed by the rising salt of the earth and the shifting sands of time. The clay tablets of the first lawmakers were buried under meters of silt, waiting for thousands of years to be rediscovered. Yet the trait remained. We carry the Sumerian conscience in our very marrow. Every time we walk through a crowded city street among thousands of strangers and feel a sense of safety, we are inhabiting the moral architecture they built. Every time we appeal to a written contract or stand before a court of law, we are echoing the scratched lines of the first scribes. We are the heirs to a biological adaptation of the mind that allowed us to transcend the tribe and embrace the civilization. As you drift into the deep rhythmic stillness of the night, imagine the silence of the great palace of Ur. The torches flicker against the mud-brick walls, casting long, dancing shadows of the laws across the floor. In that stillness, the ancient wild heart of the hunter is finally at rest, tethered to a dream of justice that is as old as the first city and as enduring as the stars. We are no longer alone in the dark. We are bound together by the invisible threads of the law, a sacred legacy of the black-headed people who first realized that for the city to breathe, the soul must be governed by the light of the word. Before the first word was ever pressed into clay, before the first brick was laid in the mud of Eridu, there was the water. It is the primordial character in the biography of our species, a substance that we carry within us, in our blood and in our tears, yet which remains forever outside our absolute control. Picture, if you will, the world of the late Pleistocene, a world where the climate was a volatile and moody deity. For tens of thousands of years, our ancestors lived as nomadic observers of the great thaw. They watched from the high ridges of the Zagros Mountains as the monstrous glaciers of the north began to weep, sending torrents of meltwater cascading down into the plains. In this era of deep time, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates were not the gentle arteries of a civilization, but wild, serpentine beasts that prowled the landscape, shifting their banks with a terrifying, unthinking power. The human body, small and fragile, was a silent witness to the immense indifference of the natural world. In the crunch of the frost beneath their feet and the roar of the distant flood, the wanderers learned a fundamental truth that would eventually be etched into the very marrow of Sumerian culture. The earth is not a permanent stage, but a shifting raft of silt and shadow. Every civilization carries a trauma in its bones, a phantom ache that survives the passage of eons, and for Sumer, that trauma was the memory of the great inundation. It was a scar on the collective psyche, a poetic processing of the volatile environment that gave them life even as it threatened to reclaim it. To understand this memory, we must look at the biography of the ear, that exquisite apparatus of bone and membrane that had spent 1,000,000 years attuned to the sounds of the wild. In the Paleolithic, the ear was trained to catch the snap of a twig or the low growl of a predator in the dark. But in the humid valleys of Mesopotamia, the ear learned a new kind of dread, the sound of the rising tide. It began as a low subterranean vibration, a thrumming in the soles of the feet that signaled the river had broken its tether. It was a sound of cosmic frustration, a roar that seemed to emanate from the gods themselves, weary of the clamor and the hubris of the cities they had allowed to bloom. Imagine a day in the life of a family in the early city of Shuruppak. The air is heavy, saturated with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of an approaching storm. For generations, they have built their lives upon the silt, trusting in the dikes and the levees they painstakingly dug with their own calloused hands. But the river does not care for the geometry of man. As the darkness gathers, the sky opens, and the deep waters are unleashed. This was the moment of the great inundation, an event so profound that it shattered the human illusion of mastery. The water did not merely rise, it erased. It dissolved the mud bricks, turned the granaries into tombs, and swallowed the narrow streets where children had played only hours before. In the survival of a few, we find the birth of the first literary exploration of human resilience, the story of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah. Ziusudra was the character who stood at the threshold of extinction and refused to cross. His story is the evolutionary duality of our spirit, the recognition of our absolute vulnerability paired with a stubborn, irrational will to endure. He did not survive through strength alone, but through foresight and the gift of the reed. He built a vessel, a wooden rib cage of life, to carry the seeds of the world through the darkness of the storm. This was the first time the human mind sought to build a world within a world, a sanctuary that could float upon the chaos. The cost of this survival was the loss of innocence. After the flood, the Sumerians were no longer a people who lived in harmony with the wild. They were a people who lived in a state of perpetual, vigilant defense. The fear of the rising tide became a part of their spiritual DNA, a silent error in the code of life that drove them to build their temples higher and their walls thicker, forever haunted by the possibility that the gods might once again wipe the slate clean. Consider the biography of the eye as it looked out over the receding waters. The landscape was no longer a familiar home, but a desolate wasteland of gray mud and broken dreams. This sight required a profound adaptation of the mind, the ability to mourn what was lost while simultaneously reaching for the shovel to rebuild. The Sumerians realized that they were but guests upon the shifting silt of the earth. Their achievements, however magnificent, were temporary loans from the deep. This realization created a unique tension in their architecture and their art. They built for eternity while knowing that the river could reclaim it all in a single night. Each ziggurat, climbing toward the stars, was a defiant response to the memory of the flood, an artificial mountain that the waters could not reach. Generations faded into the dust, yet the memory of the great inundation echoed through the later traditions of the world, becoming the blueprint for the deluges of the Bible and the epics of the Greeks. It was the first time we realized that our destiny was tied to the health of the planet and the whims of the climate. The ancient accidents of the Mesopotamian flood cycle became the foundation of our global mythology. We still carry this trauma today, in our modern anxieties about rising seas and the instability of the world we have built. We are still the children of Ziusudra, huddled in our technological vessels, watching the horizon for the first signs of the storm. As you drift into the deep, rhythmic stillness of sleep, imagine the sound of the rain against the reed mats of an ancient Sumerian home. It is a hypnotic, cleansing sound, a reminder of the fragility and the beauty of our existence. We are built of the same water that once threatened to erase us, and we carry the same resilience that allowed a single man to save the world on a raft of wood and hope. The memory of loss is not a burden, but a guide, a silent witness that teaches us to value the ground beneath our feet and the life within our lungs. The tide may rise and the rivers may surge, but as long as we remember the story of the flood, we carry the spark of the first dawn within us, ready to rebuild once more. In the deep velvet hush of the prehistoric world, long before the first line was etched into the clay, The earth possessed a terrifying, pristine purity. Picture, if you will, the world of the Pleistocene, a landscape of such immense, lonely beauty that it would seem alien to our modern eyes. Here, the soil was a sacred, unviolated skin, and the rivers Tigris and Euphrates flowed through a wilderness that knew nothing of the plow or the canal. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors moved across this terrain as light as a nomadic breath. They were part of the cycle of growth and decay, their impact on the earth as fleeting as the wood smoke that drifted from the fires of the Great Rift Valley. In this era of deep time, the soil was a character of infinite patience, a silent witness to the migration of the mammoth and the slow, rhythmic dance of the seasons. There was no accumulation, no excess, and no betrayal of the land. We were creatures of the wild, governed by the same ancient laws that commanded the flowering of the acacia or the falling of the snow. But as the great ice sheets retreated and the humid warmth of the Neolithic revolution settled our restless feet into the deltas of Mesopotamia, a profound transformation began to ripple through the human spirit. The biography of the earth entered a new, more intimate chapter. We began to look at the soil not as a sacred ground to be traversed, but as a resource to be mastered. We built cities of mud and straw, and we carved veins into the dust to lead the river's lifeblood to our thirsty crops. For 1,000 years, this was our golden tide. The emerald fields of barley and wheat stretched to the horizon, a verdant testimony to the brilliance of the Sumerian mind. But deep within this triumph, a silent error was beginning to accumulate, an ancient accident of chemistry that would eventually rewrite our destiny and bring a slow, melancholy sunset to the first great civilization of man. Consider the biography of the tongue, that exquisite muscle of bone and memory that had spent 1,000,000 years refining the sounds of the wilderness. In the Paleolithic, the tongue was a tool of immediate survival, shaped to mimic the call of the bird or to signal the approach of the predator. But in the halls of Ur and Nippur, the tongue became the vessel for a language of such complexity that it felt gifted by the gods. Sumerian was a linguistic island, a sophisticated code that gave a voice to the silent centuries. Yet, as the sun began to set on the golden tide, the tongue experienced its own slow retreat. The language that had named the stars and codified the first laws began to fade from the dusty streets, retreating into the cool, dark sanctuary of the temples. It became a sacred tongue, a ghost of a voice used only by the elite, much like the Latin that would echo through the cathedrals of a distant future. The vibrant, living speech of the marketplace was replaced by the dialects of encroaching empires, a linguistic echo of a dream that was slowly sliding back into the dust. The tragedy of Sumer was not a sudden catastrophe of fire and sword, but a slow, invisible poisoning of the very earth that had sustained it. The irrigation canals, those miracles of fluid grace that had turned the desert into a paradise, carried a hidden passenger: salt. In the scorching heat of the Mesopotamian sun, the water evaporated from the fields, leaving behind minute, crystalline traces of minerals. For centuries, this was a negligible cost, a silent ghost in the machinery of progress. But as the centuries turned into millennia, the weight of the silt became the weight of the salt. The emerald fields began to whiten, a pale shroud of saline dust rising from the earth. The soil, overtaxed by the demands of a growing population and the relentless cycles of the harvest, began to choke. This was the adaptation versus cost, in its most visceral form. We had traded the nomadic freedom of the wild for the sedentary wealth of the farm, but we had failed to realize that the earth has a memory, and it does not forgive a debt unpaid. Imagine a day in the life of a farmer in the waning years of Lagash. The air is heavy with the scent of dry reeds and the metallic tang of a failed harvest. He kneels in his field, his hands, those ancient tools of the hunt, now gnarled by the labor of the plow, reaching down to touch the soil. But the earth no longer feels like the flesh of a god. It feels cold, brittle, and dead. A white crust has formed over the rows where the barley once stood tall and golden. He remembers the stories his grandfather told, stories of an era when the land was so fertile that a single seed could feed a family for a week. Now, he struggles to coax a meager handful of grain from the parched throat of the desert. The survival advantage of irrigation has become a vulnerability of systemic collapse. He looks toward the city, where the great ziggurat still climbs toward the stars, but its edges are beginning to soften, blurred by the wind and the encroaching sand. The political foundations of the city-states began to crumble as the harvests failed. The first shadows of the law were no longer enough to harmonize the conflicting desires of a hungry populace. Strife rippled through the streets, and the once mighty kings found their power eroded by the same salt that killed their crops. Encroaching empires, sensing the weakness of the delta, began to press against the borders. The sacred knowledge of the black-headed people was no longer a shield. They were falling prey to the inevitable rhythm of history, the ebb of the tide. It was a gentle, melancholy sliding back into the dust. The great libraries of clay were buried by the shifting silt of the river, and the canals that had once been the veins of the world were choked by the desert. As the silence returned to the marshes, it was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded the first dawn. It was a silence heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 years of glory. The biography of the eye now looked upon a landscape of ruins, where the works of men appeared more like natural hills than the monuments of a civilization. The ziggurats, those artificial mountains built to touch the hem of the gods, were being reclaimed by the earth. Their sharp geometric confidence was being smoothed away by the wind until they became part of the desolate horizon once more. The reeds still swayed in the breeze, and the rivers still flowed toward the sea, but the spirit of the people had moved on, carried away by the currents of time. Generations faded into the dust, and the memory of Sumer became a myth, a whispered story of a lost paradise. Yet the trait remained. We carry the Sumerian melancholy in our bones, the knowledge that nothing we build is eternal, and that our greatest achievements are but temporary guests upon the earth. We see the legacy of their fall in our own modern struggles with the environment, a silent witness to the cost of overtaxing the land. We are the heirs to their sunset, still learning the lesson that the earth and the sky are not just a stage for our drama, but a part of our own biological identity. As you drift into the deep, rhythmic stillness of sleep, imagine the wind blowing across the ruins of Ur. Hear the soft, whispering sound of the sand as it covers the last of the mud bricks. It is a slow and gentle sound, a lullaby for a fallen empire. We are no longer the masters of the delta. We are the dreamers who remember the golden tide. The sunset is complete, but in the darkness, the stars still shine with the same geometry that the first priests mapped 5,000 years ago. The story of Sumer is not a tragedy of ending, but a poem of transition, a reminder that while the tide must always ebb, the river continues to flow, carrying the seeds of the next dawn toward a future we cannot yet see. In the deep velvet hush of our modern world, where the hum of electricity has replaced the crackle of the campfire, there exists a presence that we rarely acknowledge, yet which governs every pulse of our artificial lives. Picture, if you will, the world as it stands tonight, a planet wrapped in a glowing web of satellites and steel, a world where the sun never truly sets. It is easy to believe that we are the masters of this era, that our technology is a modern miracle born of our own singular genius. But as you lie in the stillness, listening to the rhythmic ticking of a clock or the distant murmur of the city, you are not alone. You are haunted. For tens of thousands of years, the human story was written in the fleeting shadows of the Paleolithic, a time of wandering and whispering, where the only legacy was the memory of the hunt and the warmth of the fire. But 5,000 years ago, in a humid delta where the Tigris and Euphrates met the sea, a silent mutation occurred, not in the bone or the marrow, but in the collective mind. Today, the Sumerians are gone. Their cities return to the silt, and their voices silenced by the desert winds. But they are not absent. They are the ghost in the machine of our daily lives, a silent witness residing in the very way we measure our days, govern our thoughts, and perceive our place in the infinite. To understand this ghost, we must look at the biography of the brain, that exquisite character that has spent millions of years adapting to the immediate visceral demands of survival. In the scorching heat of the African savanna, or the biting, crystalline air of the Ice Age tundra, the brain was a solitary weapon. It was forged to navigate the now, the snap of a twig, the scent of the predator, the direction of the wind. Time was a fluid, unmeasured thing, marked only by the rising of the sun and the falling of the dark. There were no divisions, no intervals, no seconds. But in the workshops of the human mind underwent a spiritual metamorphosis. It was a mutation of organization, a silent error in the code of human behavior that allowed us to transcend the limitations of the individual. The Sumerians were the first to realize that we could build something that outlasts our own breath. They learned to write their names in the stars, not as a poetic gesture, but as a meticulous system of record-keeping that anchored the human soul to the permanence of the universe. Every time you look at a watch and see the 60 divisions of an hour, you are performing an ancient Sumerian ritual. This was not a slow discovery of logic, but an elegant revelation based on the base 60 mathematics of the delta. Consider the evolutionary duality of this invention. The survival advantage was staggering. It gave us the ability to synchronize the movements of thousands, to coordinate the labor of the field with the rituals of the temple. It allowed humanity to function as a single, massive organism. But the cost was the loss of the nomadic timelessness. We traded the freedom of the seasons for the tyranny of the second. We became a species that lives by the clock. Our heartbeats echoed in the mechanical ticking of a device that was conceived in the mud of Mesopotamia. When you look at the stars tonight and recognize the shapes of the zodiac, you are reading a Sumerian map. Those celestial animals were first named by eyes that looked up from a ziggurat 5 millennia ago, seeking order in the chaos of the night. Imagine a day in the life of a modern man, moving through the concrete canyons of a 21st century city. He believes he is a creature of the future, yet every aspect of his existence is rooted in the overnight miracle of the Near East. The walls that surround him, The very concept of the room and the street are vestiges of the first mud-brick geometry. The laws that govern his conduct, the contracts that secure his labor, and the money that flows through his hands are all descendants of the tablets of the scribe. The Sumerians taught us the belief that we can build a world of our own making, a civilization that stands as a fortress against the indifference of nature. This was their biological adaptation, the record. By pressing a reed into wet clay, they created a memory that did not die with the flesh. They were the first to understand that data is the true lifeblood of the future. As the ice of the Paleolithic retreated, the human species found itself in a long and breathless suspension, waiting for the spark that would allow it to claim the earth. The Sumerians provided that spark. They were the children of the silt who learned that the earth was not just a ground to be walked upon, but a material to be shaped. The bed you lie in, the walls that shelter you from the night, and the very thoughts you use to process this story were shaped in the workshops of the Fertile Crescent. The biography of the home began there, in the transition from the hide tent to the permanent dwelling. This shift required a new kind of social cohesion, a collective sacrifice that allowed for the birth of the state and the rise of the individual within the collective. We are the inheritors of that sacrifice, the beneficiaries of a system that allows us to dream while others dig. Scientific discovery often treats Sumer as a dry archaeological puzzle, a collection of broken pots and weathered bricks. But in the narrator's voice, it is a story of biological wonder, the moment the silent witness of the soul found its voice through the machine of society. We see it in the biography of the bone of the modern world. Our skeletons are no longer those of the restless wanderer, but of the sedentary builder. We have adapted our bodies to the chair, the desk, and the screen, continuing the work that began in the first palaces of Nippur. The survival versus vulnerability of our modern era is a direct continuation of the Sumerian gamble. We are more powerful than any species that has ever lived, yet we are more fragile, dependent on the invisible threads of organization and record-keeping that hold our complex world together. Generations have faded into the dust of the Delta, and the great cities of the black-headed people have been swallowed by the sand. The cradle is empty. The Tigris and the Euphrates still flow, but the priests and the scribes have long since departed. Yet, as you drift into sleep, remember that the child has grown to cover the earth. The ghost of Sumer is in the rhythm of your breathing, in the structure of your society, and in the very way you conceptualize the passage of time. They are the silent architects of your reality, the ones who first dared to think that a human name could be carved into the fabric of eternity. In the silence of the night, the machine still hums. The 60 seconds of the minute tick away, a rhythmic pulse that connects you to the first dawn of the Delta. You are a part of a 5,000-year-old dream, a participant in a continuous story that began when a hand first reached into the mud and pulled out the future. As the darkness closes in, feel the warmth of the first fire and the security of the first wall. The Sumerians are gone, but through us, they are immortal. They are the memory carved in our bone, the script written in our stars, and the ghost that walks beside us in the light of the modern day.